State. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies were stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. All right. Today's episode is both in tradition of how we do this and a little bit of a hybrid. We have our friend of the show, Rasul Mowatt, here with us, and Ryan will be here co-hosting. Our other two co-hosts are still dealing with their newly born children. So they're away right now. Hopefully they'll be back soon. Terrell, it's about time for Terrell to get back. Cam just had her, so congratulations to Cam. The child's not even a month old. So congratulations to her and her husband. So instead of us doing, normally when Rasul comes on, is to interview him about something that he wrote, because he writes a book every year. So it's usually about that. But this time, even though he is writing another book, he can talk about that if he wants. But this time we recently, him and I recently wrote a piece called Bootleg Rehab, Still Laundering Black Rage, and it's I guess the best way to say, like, a materialist critique of DEI. So today's myth is radical woke DEI, which, a lot of this has been coming out of the right, but we have a much broader critique to walk through here. So instead of it just being a interview, because I don't like interviewing myself anyway, it's always weird. So Rasul's just joining as a co-host, and we're gonna do this for those who are regular listeners of the show, like one of the episodes where it's just the team and we walk through a myth, like the history of it and such and such. And then maybe the second half of this will get a bit more interview based. So we're going to pull from our piece, but we're also going to pull from the research that went into our piece and just other research. Some of you might have heard us talk about this piece on Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. That was our first kind of, I guess, interview on it. So this one will be some of that information, but also be new information and things that we dug up, and also an opportunity to maybe dig deeper into some of that information that we discussed in a more organized way. So Rasul, welcome. I don't know if there's anything you want to say on this, but this is your first time being a co-host, quote unquote.
Look, if y'all remember, I myself and Ryan interviewed you.
Yeah.
So it's good to be back. I'm not going to do my imitation of Cam or Terrell. So I'll try to be my best self here for everybody.
You're not gonna smoke or anything like Terrell, or
go on a tangent like Cam.
I don't have a cup. I don't have a cup to pour anything into. So.
Oh man. So yeah. So I guess just to start out, as we always do, on just the reflections of this myth, because this is sometimes we do like myths as, I guess, kind of like the quote of the phrase that people say, and then sometimes we just do a specific kind of argument. So this is more around the idea of the phrase. So radical woke DEI. Originally we were just going to do something a little bit different, but this is the phrase that's been this and different versions of this. Just radical wokeness, DEI, all of these terms are being thrown around and conflated, and we don't really know what anything means. But at the core of it is this argument that DEI has these radical roots, or it comes from some kind of radical tradition that is attempting to ruin the fabric of America. And you primarily hear this from the right, but the liberals, people who might think they're on the left or whatever, who have defended DEI for so long, have tried to interject so-called radical terminology into it. While like the argument we make in our piece, why watering it down, why make it into a basically bootleg form and low grade nonsense. But not a lot of critiques come out of the so-called left or from at least the other side on this topic. So we're going to offer some of that today, but also just get into a history of where this comes from. So a few pieces we could cite so people don't think we're just making this up. Obviously, the Trump administration went forward with this the executive order that they released at the beginning of the year. I'm trying to get rid of any kind of governmental programs related to DEI, and also saying because of this executive order that all DEI is illegal, which they have not actually proven in court. But this comes out of a broader like intellectual critique on the right, and I would encourage people to actually read this when I'm about to reference the called The Radicalization of Race, Philanthropy, and DEI. This is written by the Heritage Foundation. This is not an endorsement of the Heritage Foundation, but this is to say if you actually want to understand topics, you do have to sometimes read the other side, quote unquote, or read the people you may not agree with. It's just how research works. I'm sorry if people don't understand that. So just to
Black's gonna be
give
on
some,
Fox News next. Is that what you're talking
yeah.
about?
So like in their piece, they say, quote, the starting point with this fundamentally flawed logic made possible the three pillars of DEI. And they say that is affirmative action, identity politics, and the underlying ideas that government and by extension private business would treat individuals differently depending on their race, all of which the big philanthropies also had a hand in cultivating. And they're primarily talking about like the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, Carnegie, those types, and there's others that spawn up later on in history. So their argument is that we'll get to the foundations much later in this thing, but their argument is that DEI comes out of this radical history. And if you read their literature, they actually don't think that DEI is, at least not in the Heritage Foundation, they give a history. They don't actually think DEI is entirely bad. They think it lost its way in a certain sense. And
Okay.
they think that the integration of things that they've basically made up out of thin air, like cultural Marxism, CRT, which isn't even a Marxist thing, but they say it is. It's critical race theory for those who don't know.
Hmm.
And then also the federal government, Lyndon B. Johnson, affirmative action. They felt like these things went too far, and they say, at least on paper, that they support, non-discrimination type of laws, even though the current administration is literally cutting down those kind of laws, right? So that's the contradiction.
Hmm.
But all of this has become you can label anything and everything DEI, radical, woke, and we don't really know what it means, right?
Exactly.
And this had
There-
been happening. I'll say this and I'll pass it on to
mhm.
y'all. This had been happening with liberals. They've been labeling everything DEI and radical too. So then when the right starts
Yeah.
doing it, it's funny to see them kind of like lose their minds when that's you kind of helped yourself or you kind of helped them, I should say, get to this point. So anyway, that's just to give people a sense of what the actual myth is. Like there's this idea that DI comes out of a certain tradition that it does not come out of, and we'll go over that. But I guess just opening thoughts from either one of you on this myth and how maybe you came around to hearing it. It's kind of hard
Hmm.
to not hear this here lately, but it has a longer tradition.
Yeah. I mean, when I originally heard about DEI, to be quite honest with you, I've never really given it much thought. Anything that is positioned by the institutions as a answer, a solution to um, answer a solution to the problems that we face every day. You don't. I learned to not take it seriously because I mean, as you learned in the episode, DI doesn't really address any of the material conditions that people are facing. Um, it's not really. It's really just a pacification. It pacifies um, people without really doing anything. It's more like you guys said in your piece, a muzzle. So it's not really there to make any kind of radical change.
Yeah. For me, I probably come at it from,
Mhm.
prior years of working within nonprofits, in various capacities, volunteer, staff, board member, and also like funding board, sort of positioned. I remember in the early 90s, the development of training sort of scenarios and situations, beginning to use terminology. First was diversity. So while we'll eventually probably go over like the history of the idea of diversity, the diversity as we sort of see it in the present day, really starts in the 90s as a sort of component of different institutions and organizations in terms of like how they wish to aspire to operate. And so they would sort of seek consultants or trainers to sort of go over that. And so diversity was like one of the first things. Inclusion then came about, but it came about as an addition at the same time as inclusion was um, also being adopted by disability rights activists. So you have two competing strands of inclusion, one dealing with the matters of accessibility of facilities and so forth, because the ADA, American Disabilities Act, was now being more enforced. And then on the other end, you have inclusion being this sort of addition to diversity, as these two things are working in concert with each other. They're not the same, right? And so you get then the fusion of the two, and then equity is eventually sort of added, probably mid 90s to the late 90s, and then you start seeing DEI really come about right before 2000 and in early 2000s, and then it begins to sort of go in different directions based upon how people sort of see the order or see the importance. So, in our article, some people may not have that sort of background and history, but these are actual terminology. So we weren't trying to joke around and just sort of, play musical chairs with letters. These are actual phases. Again, that goes back to first using diversity D, within training programs, and now coming to the present day where DEI as a sort of blanket term for where I think people more so are in the United States, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and belonging. Um, it's interesting that none of these really ever had concrete definitions. In some cases, trainers and consultants didn't even define the terms on their own, and so
Yeah.
they just train people based upon people's assumption of what they may be, um, or sometimes they would just use dictionary terms, which also maybe suggests how weak the actual concepts were in the first place. Because if we're using a dictionary to sort of explain justice, how much are we actually trying to pursue justice? So that, again, when I hear this, it just sort of takes me back to those trainings. And I guess one additional point, part of that nonprofit world, especially during this time, as an example of diversity, you began to see the desire to somehow be informed by other cultures. And so Africa, as a country, instead of a continent, was one of the one of the things that people were beginning to adopt. And there was this sort of slogan and phrasing that everybody began to adopt, which was, "It takes a village to raise a child." One, we have, there's no specific origin of where that
None.
comes from any
Yeah.
particular culture: Hausa, Igbo, Igbo, Zulu, the Hutu. There's no sort of location that you can sort of identify that. And so some people have tried to sort of say that, well, it represents the sort of spirit of African culture. And again, the continent of Africa has multiple cultures, right? And operations, and you know, and um, and we don't even tear apart the whole idea of village and not cities, and just the fact that there's just different operations to have social relationships, right? But that phrase was also part of it, and one of the early sort of cashing in on that is 1996 with Hillary Clinton publishing a book called "It Takes a Village to Raise a Child." She didn't technically actually write it. Barbara Fynum was the ghostwriter for it, but yeah, so people may look back and think that she actually created the phrase, but no, it was already in effect, just a little bit beforehand. But she was catching the early part of the wave of that phrase where you had whole conferences with a theme. People were wearing T-shirts, for volunteer programs or events and so forth, as if it meant something. And, for us, it did mean something, but I don't think we really knew what it meant or was able to really articulate it into doing something about it. So yeah, again, it just sort of takes me back to that time period of trainings and workshops.
Yeah, that reminds me of that. I don't know if I can find it. You brought up Hillary Clinton. It just brought me back. Remember when 2016, when she was running, when I edit this, I'll put it on the screen. But she said, she just like the book, she didn't write that. And she didn't write this tweet either, but she said, we face a complex intersectional set of challenges. We need solutions and real plans for all of them. And then
Yeah.
she has like a web, like holding corporations accountable leadership, investments in communities of color, good public schools, increased access to nutritional care, universal health care, even though she literally opposed that, more jobs and higher wages. Like this was Hillary Clinton's,
Hmm.
PR team tweeting this out.
Of course.
Um, Probably to try to outflank Bernie at the time because there was an interesting play in terms of how some of the DEI language would be used to say that he's just a kind of class reductionist white guy, which some
Hmm.
of that was legitimate, but it was a way to outflank him and say, well, he doesn't talk enough about race or whatever. Like she famously said when he talked about when her husband Bill Clinton repealed what was it, the Glass-Steagall Act, and she was like, well, that won't end racism if you bring that back or something like that, right? Like that was
It's it's wild.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
As
yeah.
I'm listening to this, it seems to be a through line, right? It's just the way they take certain terms and just make it very vague, right? Diversity,
Yeah,
inclusion, all these other iterations of the DEI, the flattening of Africa. It just seems like it's just very just like you kind of said, you could take any of these terms, any of these letters, and you can ascribe any kind of meaning that you want to mean what they want it to mean. So therefore, since there's no concrete definition, you can make the training however you wanted to make it. You can speak on it however you want to speak. It becomes you
it's
can just fill in the
nebulous.
blank. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's very
yeah,
nebulous.
and therefore you're never really accountable for anything. This is a random page at the University of Virginia, the Department of Psychology. I'm
Hmm.
just showing people how broadly this expands. Has a
Hmm.
page on what are diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've all seen the chart where equality is when you stand next to people and you're all like equally standing, but we all can't reach the tree for those who are listening to this. And then equity is when we all have different stools that we could stand on so we can all reach the tree and get the fruits that we need. This is literally a graph. There's an
Hmm.
inclusion one. It has exclusion, where it has like a circle of dots, and the colored dots are on the outside, and the and the regular dots are on the inside, and that's exclusion. And integration is just a small little token of dots inside a broader circle of dots. And then segregation is the colored dots as a circle outside. I don't really know what the difference between exclusion and segregation necessarily is here. And then inclusion is where all the dots are just inside the thing. And we've seen all this float on social media, and then they use these definitions, and this is kind of give us definitions because again, like Rasul said,
Hmm.
there's not really a like certain canons of thought have like defined things. Like if you go to
Right.
particularly like hard sciences, they define things specifically and then they update them over time.
Hmm.
DEI has never done any of this. So diversity is all the ways in which people differ.
Yeah, I was just going
Equi-
to add in
yeah.
there, if you want to sort of search for the people who are going to be on YouTube, go to for YouTube the unequal opportunity race. That's one of the examples of a video that had been used, probably still is used for trainings. And so it's the other thing that people may have seen, which is a race where certain people have
Mm-hmm.
certain, advantages, and some people have sort of other sort of deficiencies, and so how to sort of even out so that people can race on an equal footing or whatever else. And so so people are supposed to take that sort of um, imagery in a training, have a discussion on it, and then somehow after 3 or 4 hour training, built upon that, apply it to whatever their workplace sort of actually sort of engages in. One of the other particular point too, in terms I said 1996 for that published book. It's interesting that that book also comes out. It takes a village to raise a child from Clinton comes out the same year that she also says super predator. So just just a
Of
thing there.
course.
I didn't
Of
have
course.
time. I didn't have really time to sort of look into whether or not one came before the other. So, like in the
I
same.
thought the Super Predator came because 94 was the crime bill, right?
But
So she says,
Clinton says it in 1996.
I thought she said that okay, I thought that was for the crime bill.
Yeah, no. So I mean,
Okay.
she is responding to it in a sense of trying to
Mm.
follow up on it. So before it was, remember the researchers,
Yep.
DiIulio,
Yep.
and
Yep.
Mm.
Yep.
and then of course
Yeah.
it's Newt Gingrich who jumps onto it, and then of course Biden comes forward with the crime bill, and then the super predator came into effect, and Clinton was a part of articulating that, as well as the sort of fears and concerns of young Black and brown teens, and which resulted in, of course, children being, tried as adults and serving in adult prisons, and also having extended sort of time, life sentences as a teenager. And so just again, they came out the same year. If I had time, I would love to sort of see if one came out before the other. So in the sense of, was she trying to clean up the super predator by coming up and it takes a village to raise a child, or she threw away it takes a village to raise a child and went super
Super
predator
predator.
to sort of help, in a sense, her husband, because that was part of Clinton's strategy, was to go farther right than the right. Um,
Mm. Hmm.
Hmm.
so
Very
be
successful at that.
Yeah, and so be harder on crime, be harder on war, and so even though he didn't sort of necessarily initiate any wars. So
I
yeah,
think that came out. I'm looking it up now. She published that book in January 1996. So she said that after the fact.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it was one of those, probably, she just threw it away. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's just
Moving.
important. It's just important to sort of think about, in the same year she has these two radically different sort of takes on, in particular, Black youth in urban, landscapes. One, we need to sort of, jointly, collectively take care of them. And on the other hand, we need to lock them up, as quickly
Yep.
as
Yep.
uh,
Yeah, it
Yeah,
went
it
crime. Just
just
forgive a timeline. It went crime bill.
uh-huh.
Super Predator was actually coined in 95, and then she says it the year next. That just to give people a timeline because it's easy to forget all. And then remember we did an episode on crack baby. That's like the baby is the crack baby, and they grow up to be a
Mm.
super predator basically.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
that was the
yeah.
kind of lineage of all of that. But yeah, that's all important. I guess to add one more thing before we actually get to the teeth. I think I'm on no, I'll still read it, but before we get into the teeth, I was I learned originally about DEI college. I had never heard of that shit until I got to college. Like I never, I'm from a smaller town, never had heard of that. And my memory of DEI was, like we got in DEI actually banned we made it. It's a long story short. I don't want to get into a long story here, but when I was in college, we made a film about black students on a predominantly white university. It was me and several of my friends, and I was I was a video production major, and the department we were in wanted us to do a film on this subject, but from a very different vantage point that was about the successes of overcoming struggle. So it's
I
basically going to be a
remember this.
commercial. Yeah, it was going to
Yeah.
be a commercial for the campus, and we didn't want to do it. I was the main one objecting to that. So we had, since we were in that department, we had the freedom to check out cameras, and we went and shot our own film.
Yeah.
The film wasn't all that, because I was 20, 21 years old, so I would do a much better film today. But but nonetheless, we didn't make it a commercial for Ball State. And then when we did it, the DEI department
Y'all got in
because
trouble.
we got the Multicultural Center to sponsor us, so the
Hmm.
DEI department called the Multicultural Center, and a black woman was over that department, and then she threw us under the bus,
Hmm.
and particularly me, and said I was this kind of this white people hating, crazy nigga or whatever, and to so much so to the point that when I wanted to come back, I tried to come back to perform poetry that next year the organization that was trying to pay me, they basically locked their account. They were not allowed to pay me. My one of my co-directors who was worked in admissions at the time and was going to get a job at Ball State was unable to get a job at Ball State due to this. And I was told this directly from someone who worked in the office. So this is not hearsay. I'm not connecting like someone that worked in the office literally told me this. And
Yeah.
it was not until that kind of administration of people in that office went away that I was able to even come back to campus to get paid like what I was actually charging. Because but I was basically banned from campus. So that was my introduction to DEI. So, I don't really have a lot of love for it personally. Try not to use my personal feelings to inform everything, but my introduction to it was obviously not all that great. So, um,
Hmm.
and I always found it to be bullshit. Anyway, well, I found interesting when we were in college, because it's like DI is taking over way more than it was even because I went to college in 2000s, late 2000s, early 2010s to give away my age. And even when Rasul went to college, I think there was more similarities. Like you just got funding through the university, like you applied for funding through like a student government or something or a programming committee, and then you put on your own events. And then somewhere down the line, the university kind of took that from students, and more the university was booking speakers. The university was doing cultural events, and it used to be the students just had to apply for funding, and they did it themselves. They weren't really like coordinating with the administration. And now when I go to campuses, I see less and less of students like coordinating their own programming, and the university doing a lot of the quote unquote cultural programming through like kind of DEI lens. And that's another way that students have even been demobilized, I would say, on campuses because they're not really taking the lead in a lot of their cultural program. Like when we wanted to do a poetry event or something, we just found the money on campus and we did it. We didn't wait for the department of whoever to put it on. If they put it on, that was great, but that wasn't really how we got down, particularly at these type of schools that didn't have a lot of money. Like Ball State University didn't have a bunch of money. So this wasn't like
Hmm.
Ryan, I know you were at IU, they had a lot more money.
Yeah.
So that model was more in place there. But at Ball State, in a lot of schools, you took over the programming committee and then you and then you put on your own programming for better or worse.
Hmm.
And DEI also has supplanted in a way, I think, student organizing. um, because it's taken over a lot because that's a way that you can introduce to some of your early types of organizing and just putting on events on campus. That's some of the earliest ways that you might learn something even before you get involved in more political stuff. And it's kind of supplanted that too. I don't know if that was intentional. I can't prove that, but it is
Hmm.
interesting that has become that's another kind of downside of it. It's professionalized it, and it's a very technocratic way where now some administrator, and I always had problems with the administrators when I was in school. When we tried to protest stuff,
Hmm.
the black faculty, advisor would shut shit down, right? Like that was
Hmm.
like so
See,
yeah.
Black, you ruined it for everybody, man. Making those enemies in administration.
But
But
no,
no,
I
for real
just
though,
yeah.
Ball State University, I mean, they're even having issues now. I mean, you talk about the Ball State Five, just these five students that were arrested for protesting in the Board of Trustees meeting. You know, they're really cracking down on what students can really do and what they can say. And it's got even worse since then. But I don't want to focus too much on Ball State right now. You know.
Yeah, yeah. It's just as an example,
Yeah.
Yeah.
you know.
And I guess just, again, going back to the whole notion of these things, starting as a training, especially first in the nonprofit world, and eventually jumping over to, universities and then and corporate entities later in the 90s.
Hmm.
Um, just for people's reference, especially if there's, older listeners like myself, this is why the era of certain sort of videos and articles started to become more known. So in academic spaces, Peggy McIntosh's,
Privilege. Yeah.
Invisible Knapsack,
Hmm.
talking about privilege started to become sort of more popular, even though she herself never intended on it to become something widely used. She was just using it in her class, right? And she shared it, in some type of conference setting, and it just became like this sort of default way to talk about actually diversity. And then you started to see the videos and profile of Jane Elliott, which is the older white woman who had long
On
since,
Oprah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
Hmm.
and again, similarly, she probably was never trying to do this on some national level and become some sort of like national expert. It's just that she happened to try to do some things in her sort of, classes to also sort of educate her children at that time. And, I forgot what grade that she was teaching in, but teaching them awareness of other people's histories and cultures. And so this is why these things start to circulate, because now there's all of a sudden, um, people are having trainings, people are being sort of in their mind receptive to change, and this is the only direction that change was happening. Probably after the Peggy McIntosh, people are looking for more, and so this is also when Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed started to become adopted in actual education settings, because it wasn't. I mean, the book is coming out in what, late 60s, 70s. It wasn't being adopted, in university settings at that time. And so it only doesn't come because, doesn't start being used until the 90s as a sort of reference point. And so you started having people supposedly read the book and then all of a sudden just put people in circles in a class, right? That was their understanding of what to do, from reading the entire pedagogy of the oppressed. Even though, of course, pedagogy of the oppressed has nothing to do with, how to sort of teach your classes and so forth. It's completely not about that at all, but if you were at that time and you weren't aware of Paulo Freire, you would swear up and down that that's what the book was. It was a teaching methods book. And so when you start reading it and you talk about, him going into like the forest and working with, farmers and so forth, you're like, well, where's the teaching methods? And so, again, I just kind of want to give people some cultural history sort of context too, because this is how then these terms are developing, taking hold, becoming more popular, seeping into other places. So somebody in nonprofits recommended probably just to people in universities, and people in universities started recommending it to people in corporate America. And so, it's being transferred, not just the sort of terms, but also all these little tips, the Peggy McIntosh book, the Jane Elliott videos, and then eventually the track videos, and then the little kids, on the fence, looking over the fence and, being, too
Equity. Yeah.
short.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
Yeah.
was about to reference that because when you
Yeah.
showed those diagrams on equality and equity and picking up the apples, I seen the fence, the one on the
Yep.
internet
Yep.
where
Yep.
they're looking
Yep.
over the fence, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
funny how that spreads so quickly. To Rasul's point, it's everywhere, and when something spreads that fast amongst all those areas, it loses its meaning. Like the source of it is just completely gone.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, and
I
there's
mean,
people.
I was just gonna say as well. It's interesting. I mean, I know we have a hatred for DEI. That's just what it is.
Hmm.
Uh, Even though we're trying to be sort of positive, but it's clear. And I'm sorry. But it was it's interesting that when people were always trying to improve on teaching these things, understanding these things, they were never going to things within their actual field of work and so forth. So if people in public housing authority for a city, they were going through a training, instead of looking at and having trainings with the kids looking over a fence, if they were concentrating on, rundown public housing with no lawn care and no
Yeah,
no change of light bulb.
lead in the
That,
paint. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and then an immaculate public housing complex where you have staff coming out and changing light bulbs and changing batteries of you know fire alarms and so forth, which would have been, you know, I'm not saying incredible, but would have been more on point with helping to train people in their respective things. So we don't have, there's no trainings that I've ever seen, especially in terms of preparing for the essay, that actually were directly related to the type of work that people were doing. So people always were training with these sort of vague metaphor like imagery, metaphor like phrasing, and so forth, which is just another point, and which is part of also our materialist sort of critique of DI, that it was never getting us to actually do anything in the
Hmm.
actual world.
One last thing I wanted to throw out before I read the monologue, and it's just be a part from the piece. Rasul talked about earlier how it started with D and then it became I, then it became E. So we have this part in the piece where it was diversity, then inclusion, diversity and inclusion, DI, equity, E, diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, valuing diversity, implicit bias, unconscious bias, equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI. These are all real acronyms. Inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, IDEA. Social justice, SJ. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, DEIJ. Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, JEDI. And then we talked about how there's a link in the piece about someone literally writing an article about how Jedis should not, like the Jedis from Star Wars, uh, should not be should not be is not a useful metaphor for justice and things of that nature. Like someone wrote a real article about this. Uh, Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, DEIB. Diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and belonging, DEIBJ, which is where I think more people are leaning towards now to kind of rebrand it or whatever. So just to give people a sense that even the acronyms are not really stable in the way that we might understand them today. Um, I'm gonna read this part from the essay, and then we're gonna get into the crux of our kind of case here. I think this part was an analogy, playing in a way, kind of messing around with the way that DI makes analogies, and and just to make a point. Um, Say a poor black neighborhood is rapidly flooded by a deluge of life-threatening drugs. To calm the outrage of their suffering, the kingpin dealing the deadly products finances a short-staffed neighborhood rehabilitation center. The center boldly pledges to end systemic trafficking of drugs. They hold community conversations chronicling addiction and put out ad nauseum statements about how drug addicts matter. Yet, while establishing the center, they simultaneously harness it to launder their drug money. Then, years after its construction, a buffoonish but competing kingpin threatens to destroy said rehab center because they say it discriminates against drug dealers. Now enraged at the cruelty of competing kingpin, the leaders of the poor black community launch a campaign to defend the bootleg rehab center as if it were their own. Nonetheless, the drugs keep flowing. To appease some in the community, the competing kingpin offers to build exclusive strip clubs in place of the bootleg rehab, in which they will also intend to launder their drug money. They promised to deliver more jobs in the bootleg rehab and make a pledge to hire Black people directly from the neighborhood, not the immigrants who migrated there as of late. They go as far as to claim the migrants are responsible for bringing in drugs, not the known dealers. So the neighborhood should be thankful for the strip clubs. Nonetheless, the drugs keep flowing. Under either regime, the kingpins are the cause of the drug epidemic in the neighborhood. Yet each offers faux remedies, i.e., fronts, that are only meant to appear to address the problem either by surface reform or delusional escape. Neither protesting nor boycotting the fronts would end the scourge of drugs in the community. Thus, if the debate is limited to bootleg rehab or strip club laundries, then the root problem, drug abuse, is never seriously addressed. Within this analogy, the problem may seem obvious, but that underestimates the extent in which some fronts go to appear as something else. If the rehab center becomes a source of income for social media influencers, academics, community activists, artists, local nonprofits, and politicians, then the interests of the neighborhood will likely become buried right beside the bodies taken by the assault of the deadly drugs. From this vantage point, the campaign to hashtag save the rehab center employs too many careers for drug abuse to ever truly end. Having the problem is far more profitable than solving it. This is a window into the current discourse surrounding DEI in the US, only worse. In response to the police murders in 2020, the subsequent subsequent black rage that followed, milquetoast DEI initiatives were offered by the state as a means to appear caring about the issue of police violence. Yet police killings have continually gone up since 2020. Police have gotten more money to kill, and poor Black communities where police killings mostly transpire are still suffering. Unfortunately, DEI initiatives, no matter how well intentioned, do not stop the cops from pulling the triggers that kill us, nor do they bring us back from the dead. They do not end the occupation of police in poor Black neighborhoods either, but they may train cops with the sensitivity necessary to occupy them. They may also serve as an ecosystem of aspiring professionals who look like the folks being murdered by the police, but oddly benefit from their deaths. In this sense, DEI is bootleg rehab, a rehab center that may liberate a few everyday people from drugs, send a few bright students to medical school on scholarship, or even hire them when they graduate, but is deeply unserious in eradicating drug abuse. When a sincere everyday worker makes the eradication of drug abuse the actual priority, they usually find themselves under siege from the careerist colleagues and the kingpins who fund them. If competing kingpins exploit this fraudulence for their own political gain, there is no need to defend the fraud as if it is rehab. The front's job is to launder our desire for rehabilitation into our complicity against it. These are the contradictions that DEI has wrought. Nonetheless, the drugs keep flowing. So that kind of speaks to, because another thing we didn't talk about was now there are people boycotting Target. That was kind of that's kind of what pushed me over the edge to want to write this actually. Uh, was they're boycotting Target because they ended their DEI initiatives. And I don't want to get into a rant about this because I really do want to get into the source of the material, but it's the as Renee Johnston pointed out and on her show on Saturdays with Renee, she looked at Target's DEI data in 2020 of their workforce and in 2023, and when you look at it, there's like no difference. They've hired no more Black people than they did. There's actually the managers of the Black managers actually went down uh, within the company. There's been in terms of people of color, they created a new square or a new like section for people of color. So they just put all the people of color in this one section to make it seem like they've made progress when you compare them next to each other. But they've made hardly any progress towards their so-called initiatives. And actually, the share of Black workers in many categories have went down or just stayed the same. The share of Latino workers has went up a little bit, but not much. And as we point out in the piece, and we'll get to later, jobs like Target and Walmart already have a decent proportion of Black people working at them because a lot of them are low-level jobs anyway. Uh, so stocking shelves and things like that are not anything to be proud of, and DEI doesn't really tend to care about. There already is diversity in poor jobs anyway, so that's not really an issue.
Right.
So that's just to show again the response to boycott something that has not even improved anything on its own terms, not even ours,
Hmm.
on its own terms, has not improved anything, should speak to where people's heads are. So
Yeah,
anyway,
it's just like it's just a waste of time, really.
yeah,
And if I can use the information, the terms both of you used in the book, it just seems like another front to launder rage.
yeah,
The whole idea of a boycott that is not going to even put a dent in Target's profits
no,
at
Well,
no,
and
all.
and
and also obscuring another boycott of Target that was happening at the same time against its surveillance activities. So,
yeah,
there were
Mm,
organizers in Milwaukee and Minneapolis, were addressing that notion. Like people aren't aware that when you come in, your face is recorded, your buying patterns are recorded, and so forth. And so this is how they sort of begin to, stock their shelves because they assume, based upon your entry habits of coming into the store maybe every Saturday, the first of the month or something like that. And so and they're keeping a log of this. And I know one of the organizers also said
man.
from a 2011 meeting of the board, one of the board members sort of said the quiet part out loud, which is, Target is just I think they said surveillance, company masquerading as a retail company. And
yeah,
and
and
so
that's
they're
why Target feels, I think, so like it brands itself off feeling more relatable, more
Yes.
homely, as
Hmm.
opposed to like a Target or not a Target, as opposed to like a
Walmart.
Walmart or something like that where it
or
feels kind of
Kmart.
stale.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Kmart that doesn't exist more,
yeah,
but Kmart, and
yeah,
and,
Hmm.
and people were calling it Target, right? Like,
yep,
because it was now
Exactly.
it was now a place that people felt okay to buy some of the clothes there because it wasn't any longer a place just to buy underwear. You could actually buy a dress shirt or a summer dress or something like that. But yeah, they do more intensive data mining than most other companies, probably, on par with law enforcement. And so yeah, just want to kind of, mention
no,
that
yeah,
it's
Wow.
yeah,
yeah.
Now that you added that caveat, because I did not know that, and now that you added that caveat, it really seems like that that whole boycott of Target that got famous on the internet, on social media, it just seemed like that was a purposely. It seemed like that was kind of like a ploy, kind of
yeah.
get.
Whether
Yeah,
whether it
it
is or
seems that
not,
way.
yeah,
Whether
whether it is or
yeah.
not, it serves that purpose. I think that's what we've often learned. Whether people coordinated it or not, I don't know, but it does serve
Hmm.
that purpose. And
Yeah,
yeah, so
like you
it's like
said, I can't prove it, but it just seems
they,
like
yeah.
yeah, that was well coordinated.
And then
Yeah,
you see bad articles coming out about the Target's lost foot traffic, like
yeah,
that, like that leads, like that means that their business is falling apart because there's not as much foot
Hmm.
traffic when you can
Hmm.
get deliveries at Target. You know what I'm saying? So foot traffic doesn't necessarily indicate that boycotts are working or not. That's not actual hard evidence one way or another. And what exactly do you want them to do that's going to change? Again, none the our primary argument in our piece and today is these things this shit does not deal with the material conditions of black people.
Hmm.
Like that's effectively it does not do that. So yeah.
yeah. And I was just going to chime in and add, like, part of, I know, Two Black You and I's work has always been to try to always be aware of the cultural context of things. So while this is happening, something else is happening. It doesn't mean,
Hmm.
to Ryan, your point, doesn't mean that it's this thing is causing this thing, but the fact that this thing is existing at the same time or comes about just a little bit after this other thing is important to note
Yeah.
because after, if you now look back on it, like we are looking back on the 60s and 70s and so forth, we can now see that there was an intentional connection
Yep.
in their correlation. In the
Yep.
middle, you couldn't, you just knew that these things were happening at the same time. We know the riots were happening at the same time as civil rights legislation. We didn't think about that they were sort of, one was creating the other. And so it's important to sort of keep note of, the cultural context of things, how things are coming about. Why do they come about? Why do they become popular and why does something else get suppressed? is definitely always something to note if you're going to be, studying, culture and power.
Yeah, and I think to kind of lead into the hard power versus soft power, it's even if things weren't initially coordinated, eventually people in power find that one thing benefits them over the other, and you'll see the support of that go up. That's just,
Gotcha.
that's how so even if it wasn't a conspiracy from the beginning, eventually there's a recognition that, oh, this is working, let's put our money behind this. Like that's just that is pretty consistent, and that can be proven pretty easily. So on that point, well, before we get into some more broader history, when we were on Millennials Killing Capitalism, Rasul had brought up a good point about soft power versus hard power, which I think once upon a time was something most people were clear about. We don't hear these phrases as much, and I think thinking about DEI as a type of soft power is helpful to framing this conversation. So could you kind of expand? I know in your book, Geography is a Threat, I will read a quote. You said, while the capability is hard power, force, coercion, and warfare are always ready, the use of soft power, culture, values, and ideals have become the preferred method of moving forward. You were talking about a specific time in history, so I don't want to just pull that out, but you can elaborate more on the difference between soft power and hard power, and maybe how it relates to DEI and other
Yeah,
things.
yeah. I mean, and so in this case, not only is there a cultural context, there is, you have to understand who the authors are, which oftentimes we don't really look into. We just read something if we read that, but but yeah, if we read, but people who are in governance, they craft reports or thesis or suggestions, especially when they end their term in whatever sort of capacity. So Margaret Thatcher comes up with the book Statecraft,
Mhm.
sort of to talk about in reflection all of what she did, which was destroy the Labor Party, labor unions, not just the Labor Party, but the labor unions in the UK, and increase the policing on Black populations and brown populations, which in the UK context would be Pakistani people and people from India, right? And so statecraft and her sort of articulation was the way in which government finds creative ways to govern beyond the traditional scopes of government. So yes, you have the judiciary and the executive branch and legislative branch, but statecraft now can think about how do you make media an unofficial and unknown fourth branch that people aren't really thinking about. How do you make education, department or education sort of, areas within an administration, a fifth area that's unofficial and is unknown. So statecraft is one of those ways in which people who are in governance began to sort of think through and articulate a new way of governing. I think her book then inspired a lot of other people to begin to write, sort of treaties and so forth. And so two particular books, Joseph Nye has a book called Soft Power, and Ordy Kittrey is the author of Lawfare. And so, again, I'm throwing out terms, but, people just need to get over it and know terms, right? And so, so besides statecraft, you have lawfare, which I'll get to in a second, but you have the soft power. And so the authors, in terms of Nye, he is a former national intelligence sort of, he was in that sort of office, right? And then, Ordy Kittrey was a former U.S. district attorney. So they're both writing in retrospect of and supposedly trying to inform the current people who are in administration how to think through and do something different.
And I think that's important to know because these aren't critiques
No,
necessarily.
no, these are
They're
recommendations.
writing, yeah, they're writing for
Yeah,
the state.
yeah,
They're writing. That's the audience.
Yeah.
yeah.
These are not like
It's not for us on Black
no
Myths, right?
no.
Like it's not that they switched up, and it was like, we need to inform people what's going on bad. No, like they are trying to provide recommendations to people who are in governance and in bureaucracies and so forth, how to do government differently. And so
Hmm.
soft power is a way to do it. And that's why I'm thinking that it's so, he was inspired by Thatcher's Statecraft, because he's saying that we need to abandon hard power, which was one of the ways in which most nation states were governing, which is, through coercion, through force, and through warfare. And so, this is the military, whether it's, the law enforcement on our streets, or Navy SEAL teams, being sent to some other particular country. That's hard power, but hard power
Hmm.
creates insurgents, and that becomes costly. The equipment for hard power is costly. The lives that are associated, even though most, people who are, especially in these, companies, don't really care so much about the lives of people who are in service. But it's costly. And so soft power has no sort of battlefield and has no sort of casualty count, because these are all the ways in which to think about how do you influence a place, so another country, or neighborhood areas, inside
Hmm.
the country, with new cultures, new values, new ideals. And so soft power are those things. And so we can think about the expression of, probably, certain types of soft drinks also at this time. Sprite begins to sort of have hip hop and basketball players,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, and so these cultural norms begin to be adopted that were once on the outside, but you're sort of framing the way in which what was on the outside, how it's going to be on the inside, because it's not going to be what it was like on the outside. So soft power
Hmm.
is that sort of idea. Soft power would be, sending jazz artists, poets to other countries to be an alternative culture to the country's culture, and the country culture.
Which is not a hypothetical. That did happen.
That did
Not,
happen. Yeah.
not a hypothetical.
In Ghana.
Yeah.
In two cases, one, people from the Harlem Renaissance, after the Harlem Renaissance, were sent to, certain places to
Mhm.
sort of, bring about American culture, even if it's American Negro culture.
Hmm.
Of course, the Congo, you had the jazz artists who were going around performing. In both cases, some artists were aware and, were fine with it. In other cases, some artists weren't aware that they were being used in this way. They just thought that they had finally got some money to be able to travel and go on a tour of another country. And what ends up happening is that, no, they're being used by some type of, agency to counteract, the culture of dissent that's, probably going to be a part of the indigenous culture
And
of
oust the leader. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, because you're instilling new values through the music, you're instilling new ideas through the TV shows. So that's all soft power. So this is why now he's, making that argument, like we should invest in soft power. We can only gain, from it. And also uh,
Yeah.
the public would be more accepting of, government's activities as opposed to, hard power. One of the sort of spaces that I, research in is, white nationalism. And, always what's mentioned is how the United States government responded to Waco as a turning point for white nationalism, because, up until that point, white nationalists were losing, hate crime.
And
Court.
Waco,
Yeah,
we got some younger listeners, so Waco.
yeah. And so Southern Poverty Law Center and other particular places were winning court cases left and right for hate crimes that were occurring all throughout the country. Now, the people of the Branch Davidians, which was a cult in Waco, Texas, were being associated with anti-government, and anti-government was being associated with white nationalism, even though it's not necessarily technically the same thing, especially not at that time. And they literally sent military tanks into this compound. And on live TV, you see, buildings clearly burning up, and
Mhm.
probably people are dying within it, as a way, they were trying to suppress, this sort of anti-government activity, and instead it created sympathy, and an outpour interest, and it also began to make these disparate organizations and white nationalism and separatism and anti-government, those three things began to talk to one another. So they start having white nationalist conferences after Waco, Texas. I know that's, for listeners, it seems like we're going on a tangent, but this is all related. I mean, this is
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
this is how wild it is. So that was a hard power thing that they did on U.S. soil, and it backfired. And so then this is then why they pulled back on, doing certain things. I remember there was this motorcycle gang that had white nationalist sort of leanings during the Obama administration, and people were up in arms with why they were just having these people like comfortably, handcuffed, on the ground, like it was 100 of them. And it's because of Waco, right? Like they can't afford to, do
There was
hard power on
what was the
TV.
stand? What was the standoff with? Was it Bundy up in Oregon? Remember that?
So that's another one. So it
Yeah,
goes
yeah.
like back to back to back. So you had Waco, you had Ruby Ridge, and that's what you're talking about. Ruby Ridge was a family who wasn't even anything. They were just off the grid people. Like they were not just anti-government, they were just anti, like, civilization. So they were trying to live, they
Mhm.
were living on their own, distilling their own water, had their own sort of, livestock, and they were, hunting in the woods and so forth. And again, to suppress this type of activity, snipers shoot, him, kill him, and also injure people in his family. And they don't have it on TV like the
Mhm.
Wake one, but what we find out is there is no major sort of, he's not a leader of anything, and anything like, like that. And uh, so it was these overreactions of hard power that really sort of manifested themselves into the growth of actually white nationalism, but also the ways in which government responded to white nationalism. But soft power and hard power, that's just those key terms.
Mhm.
So we can think about then diversity DEI being adopted or taken over or created by soft power. In some cases, it probably wasn't created by official soft power because soft power hadn't been conceived, back in the 60s, and they weren't really implementing it as well. You had probably proponents of it trying to push it,
Mhm.
but most people around were trying to do hard, power both domestically and internationally. And then connected to it, I mentioned lawfare, and so that's also the same, to some respect, concept. Again, another author. So Joseph Nye is soft power, and Ordy Kitchery is lawfare. And lawfare is the thing to probably do as opposed to warfare. So
Mhm.
warfare is the same thing as hard power, but warfare is more clear and direct. It is just military force. And then lawfare would be, doing things through legislation, policy change, government, leadership change, constitution change. And so so in that book, he's recommending more efforts to understand law, to then draft better laws in other countries, and engage in lawfare as opposed to warfare. So very similar ideas, very similar conclusions, but two different terms. But in the context of what we're talking about are the ways in which, soft power, DI is, either a precursor to soft power, or it was a part of early phases of soft power, so proto soft power before the term
Before
actually,
the term, yeah, because
came.
The CIA did a lot of soft power.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I think
It,
one of the classic episodes of Anthony Bourdain's show, Places Unknown, was when he went to Laos, and in his opening, he always does a good job with history and talks about how Laos is next to Vietnam. And so at the same time, you have, the Department of Defense, doing massive hard power on Vietnam. The CIA was able to convince, the administration just to follow a different route with Laos. And they just sent three CIA agents, no military, just three CIA agents. And those three CIA agents created like poetry circles,
Hmm.
mountain spas, a food culture and so forth. And they actually prevented Laos to be, becoming a second Vietnam front just by spreading those three officers all around the entire country of Laos. Three CIA. I mean, again, I just want to make sure people understand it. They didn't have backup. They didn't have,
Right.
like they literally just sent these three dudes who did not actually be in the same space. So they just went to different places, probably one was acting like a backpacker, another one was probably acting like a professor, another one was acting like, some type of, banker or something like that. And they just influence, in major ways, they moved themselves into positions to sort of make recommendations, provide different things and so forth. And it completely prevented Laos from being a second Vietnam or even a backer of Vietnam because it was beginning to move in the direction of communism,
Mhm.
as an additional area. So they got in there way before it even took root, well enough. So soft power, yes, there was probably earlier concepts of it, but the whole point is that those early concepts were not widely accepted. These were like exceptions to the rule to implement them. And what we're probably thinking, through our pieces, soft power is now more the actual
Yeah.
dominant.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
those were
And
experiments. Like you said, there was only three
mhm.
officers. The CIA tried a lot of weird shit in their early years that you could probably call soft power. Some of them were major failures. I mean, even going as far as filming pornos of leaders to try to
I
discredit
remember we
them.
talked about that. Yeah.
Yeah, or this you could I mean the stuff they did with Castro, trying to make his beard fall out or mess with his
Yeah.
cigar. I mean,
Yeah.
these were
Yeah.
assassination attempts, but I'm
Yeah.
saying in some cases, but sometimes they were just trying to discredit him. I mean, you can go all day with that, but I mean, even with Lumumba, like we were talking about the Congo, and the thing about it back then was these entities often didn't even know what the other side was doing. So like that book, Jakarta Method, the author talks about how the State Department and the CIA had totally different agendas. One was a more conciliatory approach to
Hmm.
Indonesia, and the other one was the more like overthrow. And what ended up happening was an entire massacre of
Hmm.
millions of people. But they don't always know what they're doing. Even when you watch TV shows, you can kind of see this bared out in like the CIA might get a better look than the State Department because the CIA is the
Hmm.
consultants on that show and the State
Yeah.
Department is the
Yeah.
consultant. So, there's all kinds of games that are being played all the time. And it's important to note that soft power complements hard power and vice versa. So it's not that soft power is just something that
I'm glad
sits
you
to
said,
itself. It's
yeah.
like no, like that's why I read that quote from Rasul. The guns are always somewhere waiting if need be. Um, but
Hmm.
but to the daily operation of power does not need to be as much. I think we see, and I think this current administration is kind of tinkering with the debate over this, but the daily operation should not be. That's the debate between Republicans and Democrats. If there is difference, is the daily way that you oppress
Hard
people and
power,
govern
soft
them.
power.
Yeah, is
Mm.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
I,
and
I was just going to say in the book, in Geography is a Threat, I talk about the Olympics, but, you
mhm.
know, the examples that we have right now could easily be, discussions on the movie Sinners and, now the Met Gala, right? And so it's not to say,
Mm.
it's not to say that automatically everything, it is not conspiracy talk. Like, so this is, fundamental backstory. We don't know if this is currently sort of in operation until probably 2030, and we look back and we find out that it was, but we can think about soft power probably somehow fueling some of the sort of extended discussions on this to keep people away from talking about more important matters. So, we just move from one thing to another, things get extended, and we have to ask ourselves, why does certain things become extended? Why do we now we had the Olympics, last year, but then had an extended like focus on it because of, the break-in that was inside of it. And so, well, all of that helped to sort of suppress any sort of protests and organizing around any particular issue. And so, yeah, so, these are important things to think about. We can look now in retrospect and have actual proven examples of memos and so forth that talked about these things. And this is why, it doesn't sound ludicrous, and it should not sound ludicrous to our, listeners, that things that we have right now should be questioned.
Yeah.
Are they, are they going on long enough to distract us from talking about the actual things? And if they are, then they very well could be, a sort of soft power production.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
When I was listening to both of you talk, there's two trains of thoughts I had in my head. One was the fact that soft power seems to be seemingly more effective just because hard power seems to get a rise out of the people, cause uprisings. People really don't like the use of hard power. But also at the same time, when you said that they both inform each other, it made me think of the idea of like base and superstructure, right? How they both kind of like spirally inform each other. Like the
mhm.
superstructure is culture, institutions, roles, rituals, so on and so forth. And you kind of connected those dots for me. I don't really necessarily have a question, but it's kind of just interesting seeing how they both, like you said, inform each other. They both, if one doesn't work, then another one gets utilized. This doesn't get utilized, and
Yeah.
this gets utilized. It's all kind of
Yeah.
like a
That's
pendulum.
why the tug of war between political parties is not
Hmm.
a useful thing to get caught up in,
Hmm.
because, they're only debating strategy, like at the
Hmm.
top of the parties. They're only debating strategy. They're not debating doing anything. And we're talking about, when I say the top, I mean like the donors and stuff like that.
Hmm.
It's a debate of strategy, and they're also hedging their bets. So you'll find these people to donate to both parties or whatever.
Hmm.
So the state is willing to kind of morph itself into leading with one over the other, depending
Hmm.
on, the time and situation. So, when profits are falling and, things are about to tighten up, you tend to see a more hard power approach come
Hmm.
out. And I think that's part of why the Trump administration, they represent that. There is a certain crisis in capital that these last few administrations have kind of just kicked down the road, kick the can down the road. So all these trade wars and all of this stuff
Hmm.
is a kind of, and we talk about this a little bit in the piece, it's kind of an admission of that. So you're having to see a more, kind of tightening of certain things. But
Hmm.
that's not unique to the United States. I mean, Batista in Cuba prior to the revolution was favored by the ruling class there because there was the rate of profit was falling. So they needed a tighter grip of power to keep the people in place. Now that
Hmm.
obviously backfired in their case,
Hmm.
but to the point of hard power. But I'm just saying, like, that's the nature of trying to maintain power, is that yin and yang
Hmm.
of how to kind of lead. But like to Rasul's point, soft power in the last, like, I don't know what the number of years we would put it on, but soft power has become more influential. I mean, I always
Hmm.
say, I think I've said on this show before, there only used to be like three or four channels on TV, man. You know, and before that there was radio. And there were like literature and books, but there was only so many ways you could even influence taste and culture in the ways
Hmm.
compared to how you can today. Right? Like so there's so many ways to influence the taste and the things that people are influenced by today, that it's not even close to the ways that people might have been influenced in the years we're about to get into.
Yeah, I think what Two Black is, again, for the listeners trying, what Two Black is sort of alluding to is thinking about if TV went off at midnight, which it did, and it didn't come back on until about 5:30, a.m., whatever else. And yes, I'm literally saying it went off in a sense of there was
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
screen that was just sort of like this sort of generic screen that would just be up on if you kept the TV on up until 5:30 a.m. So if it's off, you can imagine if there were people who were having discussion groups and
Hmm.
go and engage in certain types of work of service to a community and so forth, how free their sort of thoughts and discussions could be, when there was no distraction, because there was no TV on, right?
Yeah.
Or certain times of the day, it would be, disinteresting sort of, things, on like Saturday afternoon was a dead period, of programming. And so that was a prime time I'm sure people took advantage of and met. And so if you start filling up the programming,
Hmm.
the channels with programming and extending the time, now you can sort of occupy people or have people choosing to be occupied
Yeah.
opposed to having people choose to become disconnected. And
Yeah.
so if that's there, and then of course, we have phones, and if we have platforms, there's multiple ways to take on different types of quote unquote learners. There are the people who need tactile sort of, ongoing distractions. So the phone becomes important. And then some people are more just visual. And so TV and streaming becomes,
Mm.
something, more sort of active and so forth.
Yeah. 24-hour news
Yeah,
cycles,
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
social
I mean,
media algorithm that's going to pump out things that
yeah.
you like looking up already. So you go further and further down the hole. You spend
Man,
more
it
hours
just
of your
feeds
time
it.
just keep looking up stuff that's
Yeah. And
completely trivial.
this is why
Mm.
again we're gonna after talking about all this, we're gonna go back to
hopefully,
the 40s.
hopefully.
But 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 this is why I like when that's why people's analysis can't be caught in like a certain time period. Like, well, why don't we do what well back in the 60s we did well again, like
Mm.
you had three channels, you know what I'm saying, that went off. I'm not saying that explains the entire difference. I'm just saying like people's time was spent differently in a different period of history. So to expect the people today to have the same level of consciousness in the same way is unserious, and it's anachronistic of understanding history. So you can't we were unified in whatever year. That's not necessarily relevant because the way people would have organized themselves in a period in which people were outside more, which people work different kinds of jobs. I mean, we can go all day. It's just
Yeah.
not going to be the same. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? So,
I was just thinking about another, like pop culture reference, if you can call it pop culture because of how what the subject matter is, but you know, think about all these different time periods, even going back to slavery in the sense of, when 12 Years a Slave, Steve McQueen, directs this one scene with, Chiwetel, Ed Ejiofor, where he's just like sitting in front of the cabin and he's just looking out and it's just a long, like shot of just him just looking. I mean, it's uncomfortable, like how long he's just sitting there because this was one of the time periods in which they weren't out harvesting, because, during the, various seasons, they weren't technically, in some cases working. So just to think about like, you know, you're stuck. Like slavery wasn't just the work, slavery was just the holding of people. And so, just to think about you had nothing, to do, so you're just sitting there, just sitting there and just sitting there, you know. So date wandering and daydreaming becomes your programming, and so again, I didn't want to necessarily go all the way back, but if people have seen that sort of flick, that's the kind of thing that I think we're trying to get people to think about is if people don't have things to fill up their time, there really isn't anything. And people are eventually going to feel their boredom. And boredom is a recipe for dissent,
yeah, yeah,
much
yeah,
less actual conditions.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
for
yeah,
conditions in which people are actually living in, because it's not necessarily people are dissenting because they're bored. It's because boredom now makes them look at more
At the
intensely
conditions.
at the condition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, they start noticing like the cracks and the mold, and they start noticing, their bills are piling up, and they start noticing, their wages have been cut, and and so because you're no
Mm,
longer just in the routine of just every day, just, monotonously going through everything, you go through the same patterns every particular, month. The first of the month was, unfortunately, a song I hate, but also it was representative of just a repetition and cycle where, you just live into the first of the month. Like,
yeah.
if we want to think
First
about
and the
that,
15th. Yeah.
yeah, if you want to think about that more critically, just how bad that is, right? That you have
Mm,
nothing else but to wait until the first of the month, and the first of the month you're gonna have this big spurge of activity because you have some money, and then of course you go broke again waiting for the next first of the month. But if
yes.
if
Yeah.
that's moved off the table, now all of a sudden first of the month becomes something else. You're thinking about more than the first of the month. You're thinking about, doing something.
Yeah, and I think again, people probably feel like this has nothing to do with DEI, but again, it's important to get it to ground this in a much deeper sense of because we talked about the boycotts and all that, but we don't really care about that. That doesn't really deal with what's the problem. So it's like having something that, frames because I mean, even when we talk about laundering, part of our argument is like if you can have something that's basically kind of predisposition, like even like you said with Laos, where this is just the way people enter into how to address a problem is framed through some analogy of like looking over a fence, or or it's framed through an analogy of dots in a circle and inclusion, and or just these little buzzwords that we hear now. That if that sets the tone, you can't get to the problem. You can't really get to the root of the thing. So when we say radical, when people use that word radical, that's
Hmm.
about getting to the root of something, right? But like you can't get to the root if these things are positioned as the pathway to enter to resolve an issue. So again,
Yeah. In a lot of
black man's neck
ways.
gets stepped on,
Yeah.
and we're buying black and we're talking about privilege. Like that's because there's a predisposition there that's what you're supposed to do, even though that does, when you actually sit back and think about it, doesn't make any sense. but but
Yeah.
those are
And
the things that
also,
are yeah.
well, yeah, just real quick, it's also they're setting the parameters of what the issue is.
Yeah.
So there's, yeah, if once they set the parameters of what the issue is, and then they're also supplying their so-called solution to the issue, and that way they'll never have to get to the bottom, the root of the problem, like you said.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like it becomes it's an interesting thing. So
Okay, fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies